Hey everyone, Anarch here, and this is another episode of Anarch Abridged. This video is going to be pretty straightforward. That is to say, the topic of the video is just how to convince people. I've done a few other videos that maybe are tangentially related to that topic. They might have been just how to convince somebody with a particular viewpoint. Another one I did was called Healthy Conflict. One of the earliest video essays I ever produced was called The Value of Dispute. But I haven't done a video that's just straight up, how do you convince people of a viewpoint they don't already hold? Well, I think first of all, I'll just get straight to the point in saying, first you need to understand how they view the world currently. No person is going to change their mind by a list of arguments if those arguments don't somehow appeal to beliefs and understandings about the world that they already hold. And even if your goal is to just dismantle the viewpoint that that person holds, step number one is you need to actually understand what it is that they believe and how they justify those beliefs. That is to say, if you want to convince someone, step number one is understanding the person you're trying to convince. Now, this can be varying in difficulty based on the person you're talking to and the context of the situation you're in. Obviously, if you are meeting somebody for the first time at a bar and it just so happens that you've stumbled onto a political topic, you're not really going to understand their broader view of the world. And you're probably also not going to understand or be able to guess whether they will or will not be receptive to the ideas that you will present to them. So might I suggest another concept which will be needed or necessary in this, and that is that you need to gauge how aggressive that you're going to be, or rather how assertively you're going to make your point, based on, number one, how well do you understand the other person's viewpoint to begin with? And number two, how long do you actually have to talk with this person? So if you don't feel like you have a very good understanding of another person, of the person's viewpoint, and you're not going to have a whole lot of time to talk with him about the topic, might I suggest that you don't do any really heavy lifting in that conversation, that you not get too oriented around trying to completely change their ideological outlook. And in that occasion, that you have a short period of time with somebody whose ideas you don't necessarily understand extremely well, you're going to have to kind of play it by ear based on the information that they give you. So they might say particular things that you're familiar with. You know, you've heard liberals say this, or you've heard people that frequent certain kinds of websites that you may or may not like that use the kinds of talking points that they're saying, even if it's subtle. You know, I don't want to make it out like it's just going to be like purely combative in every circumstance, but instead, you know, for example, like imagine you're sitting there and you're just talking with some random person you met at a bar, and, you know, some political topic comes up and you're talking about some terrible thing that's taking place, and they respond something like, well, you know, nothing much we can do about that. I guess, you know, we just need to vote next time the presidential election comes around. That viewpoint should give you at least some understanding of the rest of the views they probably hold. You aren't going to be able to discern for sure all of those other beliefs, but it at least suggests the other sorts of beliefs they might have. You could probably assess that that person is not very politically engaged. You could probably assess that person is a liberal, most likely, probably not even like a conservative or something, but probably a liberal. And from that, you can kind of gather that they're probably going to be pretty politically apathetic. With that in mind, you probably shouldn't approach that person with really hardcore radical ideology unless you are able to do so in a way that in a very short period of time might make them question their beliefs, but not believing that what you're going to do is change their mind completely within short order. And in the occasion that I'm describing here, which actually arises somewhat often, maybe not the specifics of them, giving that particular response, but them having a viewpoint that you're probably not going to be able to change in short order and that you don't have a whole lot of time, your goal should just to be to sort of plant this seed of doubt about the current way they look at the world. And in the same breath, if possible, give some suggestion as to the correct course of action. And you don't need it to be really explicit. Sometimes subtlety would work best. In this occasion, for example, perhaps if I were sitting there with them, I might say something like, yeah, well, we keep voting and nothing's changing. I think they're just relying on us not working together in order to change things. Now, me and you, or those of you who are watching the channel, I suppose, probably recognize that what I'm trying to do is intimate a revolutionary perspective or a perspective based around direct action. And that's absolutely the case. But the strength of this more subtle approach is that it will hopefully connect with them where they are already at. It might sink in to those times when they are doubting the electoral process, when they are doubting the state as a tool to get things done. It might sort of get them to at least consider the use of mass protest and the use of civil disobedience. It might like catalyze a belief in the need for more extreme methods. Now, it probably isn't going to do that on the spot, but hopefully that little short thought, that little, a quippy 2 or 3 sentences might arrive again at a later date when they are starting to doubt those things more seriously. And I think that's really what I would like to emphasize. The key when convincing a person is not to convince them on the spot. I'd like to emphasize that hardly ever happens. People rarely, and I mean very rarely, almost never, change their minds on the spot, even about things that are somewhat trivial, things that really would have no impact on their life where they change their mind. People don't tend to change their mind there when you produce the argument that should persuade them or the evidence that should make them see the error of their ways. That's really not how anybody's mind works. And more likely they are going to put up some amount of resistance, and on the spot, they may even vehemently deny that you've even proven a point, that you have said anything that is of any substance or has changed their mind at all. Even though they might have already begun experiencing doubts within that short interaction that you've already had. The goal is actually to change their mind afterwards. What you're hoping to do is, as I said, plant that seed of doubt or give them some sort of embryonic idea that if they were to take that idea to its furthest extent and they were to develop that idea a few steps down the line, it would lead to the development of what you're trying to convince them of. There's so many sayings revolving around this idea of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. The idea is you should be trying to give people the impression they're the one that figured out the answer. All this stuff is kind of trivially correct, but what I'd like to suggest is that you take this more subtle approach when you are not going to be able to get much else done. And then as you know the person better and as you understand their viewpoint better, or especially if you are going to have more opportunities to speak with them, say it's somebody that you're going to see again every week or every day, you know, a family member or a coworker or a friend or something. Well, first might I say that you should probably understand their viewpoint much, much better. Hopefully you shouldn't have to be doing any guessing about what they actually think about the world. And if you do have to do some guessing, I'd like to suggest that you start by just doing a sort of fact-finding mission with this person. Just try to understand how they view different ideas. Don't start in trying to dismantle their ideology or trying to produce some problematic that's going to, plant the seed of doubt. Start instead by just asking them questions. Ask them questions. For example, let's say back to our situation of, the person saying, well, I guess, we just got to vote next time. Asking simple questions. Do you think voting is enough? Is there a president that you think fixed all the problems while they were there? Is there an example you've got in mind? Do you believe that the system can fix itself? Those sorts of things. Okay. Asking these sort of probing questions, as you might call them, trying to understand how they view the world. I think a lot of the time you're going to find that people really don't have some elaborately put together ideological standpoint. The majority of people actually are just kind of intuiting their way through things. They're kind of feeling it out. They're really not thinking about it a whole lot, and they're not thinking about it very in depth. And when they do think about, serious matters, a lot of the time they're probably they probably feel distress and then immediately want to run away from that feeling of distress. And especially given political matters, right? And when you're in a state of when you feel like the world is very scary and difficult to understand, you also are going to feel less likely that you want to go around questioning things and feeling skeptical. You are going to tend to be, when I say conservative, I don't mean politically conservative necessarily. You're going to be conservative insofar as you're trying to conserve your energy. You're trying to conserve your emotional, physical, and mental energy. And so you're not going to spend too much time thinking about things that are emotionally stressful, that are mentally difficult. You're already stressed. You don't need that extra stress of thinking through those things. So talking to people about these subjects sometimes is just going to feel like a threat to them. And when that happens, insofar as the person's just kind of intimating to you that they don't have the mental energy for it, you probably should just back off and try to plant one of those seeds of doubt, like I said. But insofar as a person actually is having this open discourse with you, which you will find can take place as long as you approach with a sense of kindness and attempt to actually understand this person's viewpoint, they may be willing to talk to you about these things, which would otherwise be very stressful for them. And I would like to suggest that as you proceed through that conversation with them, recognize that you're probably going to be producing stress within them, and think about whether you want to increase that stress throughout the conversation, and to what end if you are to increase that stress. Now, with this in mind, you might think that what I'm suggesting here is this sort of handling people with kid gloves, or just being overly gentle and sort of coddling them. And that's not necessarily what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that you take a sort of progressively more assertive approach based on how the person responds as you probe and ask questions and make suggestions about how you see things. And if the person is responding in a way where they are interested in the conversation and you've engaged them in thought and you are starting to understand their viewpoint better, and you can tell that even if they're not necessarily receptive to what you're saying, that they're hearing you and they're conversing and they're like engaging with what you're saying, then you can become maybe increasingly more assertive. You can say more plainly what it is that you actually think. You can produce criticisms in measure to how comfortable they've demonstrated they are with the conversation. One thing I also want to say is that people will kind of expose to you how much thinking they've already done on the subject by how willing they are to explain their reasoning a lot of the time. If they don't want to explain their reasoning or don't seem to go more than maybe one step past the beginning, it's probably because that's as far as they've thought through the subject. You know, they don't have sophisticated opinions. And this brings me to another thing that I want to say, and I think it's really important for people to understand, is that the average person doesn't have a well-developed ideological lens. That's not to say they may not have some sort of ideological underpinnings to their beliefs, that you may not be able to hear everything they think and then go, oh, you know, you're an X or a Y or a Z or, you know, one or another ideology. It's to say people are generally not thinking through their beliefs and looking for consistency and trying their very best to get rid of internal contradictions and all of that. The majority of people just memorize a list of ideas and thoughts and sayings and witty little things that they heard somebody else say on a newscast, or a friend said it one time, or they read it on the internet or something. And most of the time they didn't then go through a process of thinking through, oh, how does that like agree with the rest of my viewpoints? Does it agree with the rest of my viewpoints? Does it not agree with the rest of my viewpoints? More likely, they're just going to accept or decline the idea based on whether it just kind of feels right. Most people in the world are operating on vibes-based politics. And the reason I bring this up is because once you understand that, I would hope that you are then less aggressive, less venomous, less cruel in trying to dismantle or tear people down for saying, something that might offend you. You know, sometimes people just are saying offensive things, not because they have some very deep ideology of bigotry or hatred or something like that like goes many layers deeper and they're secretly crypto, but instead just that they haven't thought about the topic very much. And one time their friend said that silly thing, or one time on Twitter, they saw somebody say a silly thing and they just repeated it. And the last three people they said it to just laughed and said, ha ha ha, so true. Or they, just gave like no critical feedback. So most people, especially on topics that are like very deep, philosophical or political, theoretical topics, scientific topics, etc., they are not used to having some intense pushback to the little quippy vibes-based things that they've learned. And so if they say something that you go, whoa, that was fucked up. Like, I can't believe you just said that. If you go all in on them and you start tearing them apart, you're not going to lead to them having some world-changing revelation of ideology. You're going to lead to them probably just losing trust in you. They're going to feel like you're cruel. They're going to feel like you're judgmental. And you're not going to change their mind in anything. And the only seed of doubt you're likely to plant is they're going to doubt you. And if you've also made the mistake of helping them understand what your ideology was in the process, now they're going to doubt your ideology as well. Much as you might hate it, you are an emissary for your ideology. So when you go into a conversation and you say you're an anarchist or a socialist or something, and then you treat people like an asshole, then they think they're probably just going to associate your ideology with assholes. They're not going to go, oh man, that socialist sure showed me. They're going to go, wow, are socialists just assholes? So like, really think all of the implications of these things through beforehand, okay? Because you're not fixing anything to just tear a person down because they said something you don't like. The next step, if they've said something that is bigoted or hateful or something, and, you know, as we said, they may not even be aware of it, is to kind of politely inform them of that, you know, like, well, I don't really think that's true, or I don't agree with you on that. I see things very different. You know, sometimes I found that just saying that is enough for a person to pause for a moment and go, oh, did I say something wrong? You know, like, you know, just that simple statement, like, well, I don't agree with you on that. I don't think that's true. Or no, I'm sorry. I, you know, that's not how I see things. Sometimes it's enough for the person to pause. They pause and they go, oh, well, I wonder why they disagree, you know, or, oh, did I say something that was like out of line? Or, you know, like now they're going to think about it a little bit, and they may even think about it afterwards if y'all don't get around to discussing it. But what I want to suggest is that it's a sort of iterative process. You gotta, it's a process of feedback. You're going to give them just a little bit to go on, you know, ask them a probing question, respond with maybe how you see things by contrast, but don't get bogged down in that. You're not trying to give them, you know, 30 lines of a logical rebuttal on the spot. That, for some people, that might work. And maybe after you've had many of these conversations, that could work. But once again, you're trying to plant that seed of doubt. You're just trying to get them to experience doubt in a longer term sense. And to be even more technical about it, what's really going on is this. In their mind, they go to some argument that they said to you after you've had your discussion. They think of the argument they said to you, and in their daily life, they produce it in their mind as the response to some stimulus. And when they produce it in their mind, they remember what you said in response to it. That's a really important part, because that's the way our minds tend to work. They kind of have this associative factor to them. So they think about what you said in response, and they're going to then develop a new response afterwards. Okay. They're going to develop, perhaps they're going to try to think of a counter argument to that now, because every time that they come back to that old argument, they keep thinking of your argument. So they maybe need to think of a counter argument, or, you know, they might develop some sort of knee-jerk reaction, anger, resentment, or denial, or something like that. That's all possible. That's just kind of part of the situation, unfortunately. And that is the developmental process of them changing their mind. That is what you're looking for. You're looking for that process of them ruminating on the discussion afterwards, thinking about what you said afterwards. And you will know if you've done this successfully, because maybe not the next time you talk to them, but at some later date when you talk to them again, you'll kind of maybe return to the same subject, but you'll find that the way they approach that subject now is different, that it has evolved or developed somehow. And you'll be able to tell, based on how that their viewpoint has evolved or developed in the interim, and the new sorts of ideas that they're presenting, the new sorts of arguments that they're making, what direction that it evolved or developed. It may have developed in a negative direction. in which case you will now need to probe about those ideas, ask questions to understand what their viewpoint is. Is it indicative that they're developing a deeper or more consistent ideology, either negative or positive? Or once again, is it just a symptom of them having seen those arguments on their feed or on a news channel or something, and they're just repeating them now? They haven't really thought about them very deeply. But this process that I'm talking about right here, this sort of iterative process where you plant those seeds of doubt or those discursive ideas they keep returning to, and then you speak with them again, and then you develop on those, and then you speak to them again, and then you develop on those. That's how, in reality, people's minds actually change. If you are frustrated with having had 1,000 discussions or gotten into 1,000 arguments, of which nobody changed their mind on the spot, nobody ever admitted you were right, and that made you feel helpless, or rather maybe hopeless about changing people's minds, it's because you had the idea wrong from the very beginning. It's not about changing people's minds there on the spot. It's about giving people the tools to later change their own minds, you might say. And the place for this sort of aggressive or assertive, rational argumentation where you were dismantling their viewpoint and, undermining their base arguments and giving arguments instead of that, that comes after the person has developed a significant sort of ideological underpinning such that they can even produce coherent arguments in response. There's no reason to go all in like that when the person doesn't even have a strong underpinning to begin with. They don't even understand their own arguments if they were to make them. And you might think, I suppose there's two reasons why that is. One, they're probably not even going to be able to appreciate the content of the arguments that you've made because they don't really have anything to contrast it with. And, all they're doing is hearing what you have to say, and they don't really know what all the opinions are. That's one thing. But another part of it is that I've noticed that when the person only has that new set of opinions, that new ideological landscape you have produced, and they had nothing beforehand, it tends to be kind of short-lived. Basically, as soon as they then come up against another competing ideology, whether it is on the opposite side or not, they will tend to kind of fold because they don't now understand the arguments against, between those two ideologies. They don't understand how they compare and contrast to one another. So that's why I suggest that it's just kind of this more iterative process. You're not trying to get people to agree with some sort of orthodoxy or a dogma. You're not trying to get them to understand the whole thing all at once, top to bottom. Because number one, that's not possible. And number two, it actually appears to be very short-lived when it takes place. So I'm sure you can tell by the content of everything I've said here, this was not like a super well-structured video. I was just kind of freely talking about the things I've noticed that work and the tendencies that I've found. I think that the one I started with is one of the most important, and that is Steelmanning your opponent. And that is to say, not straw manning the opposite. You're trying to understand their viewpoint very, very well. And then after they've given you a consistent set of arguments, you want to understand those series of arguments even better than they do. You want to be able to argue for their own point better than they would be able to argue for their own point. And what you'll find is when the time comes, when the two of you finally have, like, say, some kind of debate or some kind of critical discourse, it will be so much more productive. Straw manning is a complete waste of time. It never helps. It's just, it's a tool that people who haven't done enough research and don't understand the ideas and the topics at hand do. The straw man is a demonstration of a person's ignorance. It is not a useful tool. It doesn't change people's minds, and it's a logical fallacy. So I'm going to cut it there. There's still so much more I could talk about, but I do think that we've covered like some of the most important aspects of changing a person's mind. These are some of these things that I've figured out over the years. Hopefully that was helpful for you. That's all I've got for this video. Might I suggest that you go down below and you like the video if you liked it. Subscribe to the channel if this is like the third or fourth or fifth video that's popped up on your feed and you just keep watching. Be sure that you subscribe to the channel and these will pop up in your subscriptions feed. If you like the work that I'm doing here at this channel, if you think that Anarch is important in the world and has some, some sort of transformative aspect to it, go over to my Patreon at patreon.com/ANARK and become a patron for any amount. That is what actually allows me to survive off of this channel. The ads are pretty much nothing. I barely make anything at all off of them. And the ad revenue has been even worse than usual lately. So I'm making even less off of them and I was already making basically nothing. So patrons are super important. These last 2 months, my patron growth has been like almost non-existent. So if you have been considering whether you want to become a patron or not, consider this your indication to go become a patron. But that's all I wanted to say. Last thing, I suppose, is that the actual metric that determines whether these videos like get big or not is when they pop up in your feed, do you click them? And when you click them, how long do you watch? So when you see my videos come up, click them and give them a watch if you haven't watched them before. I know it sounds really simple, but that's what determines whether these things get pushed in the algorithm. But, that's it for today. I have unfortunately not managed to keep this under 30 minutes, but that's all I got for now. I'll see y'all next time.